Okay, so we're now ready to take our turning animations and add them to our animation blueprint. One thing that we need to fix, however, before we do that is the fact that our animations turn in place, and we want to handle the turning ourselves. In the animation blueprint, we don't want our animation to turn us, similarly to how we don't want our animation to move the base location of the character. We want to handle all the movement. And so sometimes what you can do if the skeleton has that root bone is you can come down here into the asset details and use enable root motion and force root lock. With enable root motion unchecked and force root lock checked, it should force the root bone to lock. However, we don't have that root bone, so we're going to have to get around that in a different way. One way we can do that is we can take our pose, if we go all the way to the end where she's turned, at the very last frame, we can enable snapping, and we can select her root bone, and we can rotate to the left by 90 degrees. And now she's facing forward. So we can click key, and now we have a key there. But because we rotated her by 90 degrees, if we scrub all the way to the first frame, you'll see that now she's rotated 90 degrees in the other direction. So at the first frame now, we can rotate her back by 90 degrees and add another key. Now if we press play, you'll see that she doesn't actually turn in place. She just performs the turning animation. So this is perfect. Go ahead and click save and close. We'll do the same thing for the other animation, crouching turn 90 right. So what we want to do is we want to scrub all the way to the end where she's turned to the right, and we're going to select the root bone and rotate back by 90 degrees and add a key. Then we'll scrub all the way to the beginning and rotate her back the other way by 90 degrees and add another key. So now if we press play, you'll see that she stays facing forward and she performs the turn in place animation. Perfect. Go ahead and click save and close. Okay, so now we're ready to implement turning in place. Let's open the Shooter Anim BP and let's go ahead and take a look at how we did turning in place for our idle state. Double click the idle state. We're in ground locomotion idle, and notice we have a layer blend per bone blending at bone spine 01, and we have an idle lower body and an idle upper body. Now the idle upper body is simply that idle, the regular idle 0 pose. But if we go back, the idle lower body, double click that, this has a state machine that goes between the left turning and right turning animations. We're going to do this exact same thing in our crouching idle state. So let's go ahead and create that. Let's go back to ground locomotion and let's go enter the crouch idle state. Now in crouch idle state, we're going to have a layered blend per bone. So we don't need this play crouch idle rifle hip. We can go ahead and disconnect that and move that up for a minute. And we're going to right click and type layered blend per bone. We're going to use that. We're going to select that, and in the details panel, we're going to add to the branch filters one element, and we're going to use spine 01, just like we did with the other idle state. Go ahead and connect that to the output pose. And now we need two more state machines, one for crouching idle lower body and one for crouching idle upper body. So right click, state machine, add new state machine, and let's call this one crouch idle lower body, and plug that into the base pose. And we'll create a new state machine here, and we'll call this state machine crouch idle upper body. Now crouch idle upper body is easy. It's just going to play crouch idle rifle hip. So let's double click that and look for crouch idle rifle hip, drag that in and connect entry to it, and we're done. That is crouch idle upper body. That's all we need to do. Now we need the actual crouch idle lower body, so double click that, and this one is going to have more complexity to the state machine. From entry, we're going to simply go straight to crouch idle rifle hip, so that one's pretty easy, but we're going to have a turn left and a turn right state. So let's go ahead and drag off and add a state, and let's call this one crouch turn left. And we'll have both an arrow going to it and from it back to idle rifle hip. Now let's add a new state and call this one crouch turn right. And this one will also have arrows going both ways. Now for crouch turn left, we're going to double click this, and we need our crouching turn 90 left animation. So I'm going to type in turn 90. And here's our crouching turn 90 left. I'm going to drag that in and simply play it. And I'm going to make sure that it's not looping, so I'm going to uncheck loop animation. Now back out, I'm going to go to crouch turn right and use crouching turn 90 right and uncheck looping there. Now the only thing that's left to do is the transition rules. So why don't we think about when we want to go from regular crouch idle to turning left? Let's go ahead and enter that transition rule. Now, we can't go from idle to turning left if we're running around. So of course, speed has to be 0. So let's right click and get our speed and see if that is equal with a double equal sign to 0. Now we're going to need several conditions here, and this is going to be an AND Boolean. And I'm going to connect the AND to the result. Now, to go from idle to turning, obviously speed needs to be 0, but we also want to see if our root yaw offset is greater than 90 degrees. So let's right click and get root yaw offset, and we're going to see if this is greater than 90. So use a greater than, float, and 90 here. And that's because when it's 90, that means we've been looking to the left counterclockwise to the point where we've looked 90 degrees and it's time to turn. Now, we also don't want to turn in place if we're in the air. So we need to check is in air and make sure that this is not true. So we need a not Boolean. So we'll add a pin to this. And these three conditions will need to all be true in order to go from idling to turning in place while crouching. Perfect. Let's go back and take a look at crouching idle to crouch turn right. Make sure you've got the correct transition rule here. Double click on it. Now this one is going to be similar. We need to make sure that speed is equal to 0. So let's get speed. Make sure speed is equal to 0, and we're also going to have an AND Boolean. So we'll connect those, and this time we're going to check root yaw offset, but we're going to see if it's less than negative 90. Less than negative 90, because if we're turning to the right, then root yaw offset is compensating for that right turn by turning the root bone all the way back in the negative direction. So this has to be negative 90 in order to turn right. And finally, we can't be in the air, so we also need to check is in air and make sure that that is not true. So we'll use a not Boolean and add a pin and plug that in. And there's that transition rule. Perfect. Okay, let's go back out. And now we want our transition rules to go from our turning animations back to idle. Let's start with crouch turn left back to crouch idle rifle hip. So we want to go back into the idle state once we've finished turning left, and we can use a time remaining ratio node. So let's type time remaining ratio, and we can check to see how much time remaining as a ratio is left. And we're going to see if it's less than a small value such as 0.1. This means that 10% of the animation is left. Now this is going to be an OR condition. So I'm going to use OR Boolean because any of these conditions can be true in order to get out of the turn animation and go back to idle. Another thing that will allow us to get out of the turning animation will be if the speed is now greater than 0. So let's get speed and see if it's greater than 0. We also want to get out of the turning animation if we're in the air. So let's get is in air and plug that one in as well. And we'll also need a new pin and we'll plug that in. And finally, we'll check root yaw offset. Let's check root yaw offset. We need to see if this is less than 0. If it's a negative value, we should not be turning left, so we need to get out of it. So let's see if it's less than 0. And we'll need a new pin as well for this one. And that's it. And now we have one last transition rule, and that's to get out of the turn right animation. So let's go into that. And this one is very similar. We're going to use a time remaining ratio. And we're going to see if the animation has 0.1 left. If it has 10% left, then we can go ahead and get out. And we're going to use an OR for this as well. So we'll connect that. We also want to get out of the turning animation if the speed is greater than 0. So we'll see if that is greater than 0. We'll add another couple of pins here. We also want to get out of the animation if we're in the air. So let's get is in air. And finally, we'll check root yaw offset and see if it's positive. If it's positive, we have no business turning right. We should be turning left. So let's right-click root yaw offset, and we'll see if it's greater than 0. And there we have it. There is our transition rule. Now, if I go ahead and select all these and hit Q, it'll straighten them all out. Okay, perfect. Let's go ahead and compile and save that. Okay, so we're ready to test this out. Now, if we go ahead and hit play, one of the things we'll realize is if we're crouching and we reach the 90 degrees point, we'll play the turn in place animation, but we won't actually turn in place. We'll stay forward. Same thing if we reach the other side, we won't actually turn. And that's because there's one vital thing missing, and that is the animation curves so that we can have our animation curve data. Now, we can go back into our animations, and if we go to our idle turn 90 left trimmed, we have the rotation curve and the turning metadata curve. And if we double click on rotation, you'll see that we started it off at negative 90 degrees and smoothly went up to 0. And that's basically for the duration of this turn. So let's go ahead and make those for those animations. I'll close out of this one and I'll go back into character, animations, and crouching, and let's go to the turn left animation. Here in the turn left animation, in the curve section, I'm going to click the drop down and select add curve, and I'm going to do the rotation curve here. Now here in rotation, we're going to need to add some keys. So right click and add key, right click, add a second key, and right click, add a third key. And now we can set the values of these. The first key is going to be at a value of 0 for the X and negative 90 for the Y. The second one is going to be roughly halfway through the animation. We can put it here at about exactly where I put it, 0.5 of the way through. And this one is going to be at negative 45. So make sure it's selected, put it at negative 45. And then the final one will be at the end of the animation. So we'll drag it out over here towards the end, and we'll put this one at 0. Now I'm going to scroll all the way out so I can see all of these points, and click and drag to zoom, and then click on zoom to fit so I can see all of the curve points. And it looks like this first point is at negative 45. I should have put it at negative 90. I might not have had it selected. So the second one is at 0.5 and negative 45. And the third one is right here, just about at the end at 0. I'm going to take this middle one and scoot it a little bit forward there so it's at about 0.6 seconds. Now I can click and drag to select all three, right click and select auto, and now we have this smooth curve. And I'm going to go ahead and select the middle one only so that it's a little bit more S-shaped, so it looks a little bit better. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to close out of this curve editor, and I'm going to click on curves, drop down, add curve, and I'm going to click add metadata, and we want the turning metadata, and that one doesn't need to be edited. Okay, so that looks good. Perfect. Let's click save and close this out. Next, we'll go to crouching turn 90 right, and we'll do the same thing. We'll go ahead and go to curves, add curve, and rotation. Double click rotation. I'm going to click pause, and I'll right click and add 3 keys. The first one will go at 0 and -90. The second one will be at, let's put it at 0.6 and -45, just like the other animation. And the third will be at, here at the end, 1.2 and 0. Now I'm going to scroll all the way out so I can see all the points, select them all, and I'll click zoom to fit, and then I'll right click and click auto. And I'll click off of them and click the middle and make the curve a bit more S-shaped. Now I'll close the curve editor, go back to curves, add a metadata curve, and choose turning, and there's our turning metadata curve. We'll go ahead and save that, close out of it, and now we're ready to give this a test. So let's go ahead and click play. I'll hit shift to go into crouching, and I'll turn 90 degrees, and we turn back. Okay, so that looks good. The only problem I have with this is that the turn in place animation is a little slow, and I also might want to trim a little off the end of it. We can do that, but I leave that up to you as a bit of a tweaking exercise. But as far as the speed, we can increase the speed by going into our crouch, turn left and right states, selecting the animation, and affecting the play rate here. I can make this about 1.25 and see how that looks. And I'll go back and change the other one to 1.25 as well, and give this a play test. So I'll crouch, and that looks a little bit better. And we can also stress test this by turning in a dramatic angle and making sure that everything works okay. We can also shoot and reload while we're turning. Now, I'm noticing something while we're crouching. There's a lot of recoil here while we're shooting. And so I'd like to go ahead and reduce that a little bit. And we can go back into our animation anim graph and go to our layered blend per bone, where we're caching loco with fire. This is blending with a weight of 1, so I'm going to go ahead and come back here and maybe try 0.5 instead. And let's see how this looks. So I'll crouch, and that looks a lot better. It looks a little funky when she's turning, so I'd like to have this much reduced while turning. So, okay, now let's see about a value of 0. Okay, so it's looking like when we're turning in place, we're not going to really want too much recoil at all. And also when we're crouching and not turning in place, we probably want a very small amount of recoil, something like that. Okay, so that's something we'll fix in the next video. We're going to probably want a variable for our layered blend per bone here, and we're going to want this to be 0 when we're turning in place, and something like 0.1 when we're crouching. Otherwise, it can be 1 if we're not in any of those states. So we'll take care of that in the next video.